Now starting the May 5th, 2022 Mount Pleasant Planning Commission meeting. Mr. Kane, will you take roll?
Friedrich.
Here.
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 Kingsworthy.
Present.
Leash.
Here.
Ortman.
Here.
Madam Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is approval of the agenda.
Move to approve. Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Next item on the agenda is approval of the minutes for the April 7th regular meeting.
Move to approve.
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Next item on the agenda is the Zoning Board of Appeals report. Commissioner Friedrich?
Madam Chair, at our April zoning board meeting, we had one case. The property is located at 931 South Fancher Street and 505 East Gaylord Street. The applicant was asking for a variance from section 154-608B to permit a lot split that would result in a lot width of less than 50 feet. The zoning board found that the property met all the qualifications for a variance. The existing lot is considerably larger than other lots in the immediate vicinity, so splitting the lot would make it more consistent with the neighborhood. Also, there are nearby lots that are currently less than 50 feet wide, so the creation of another such lot would not be inconsistent with the neighborhood. Splitting the lot in any other location other than the one proposed would either increase nonconformities or necessitate the demolition of a pre-existing garage. Therefore, the variance was granted.
Thank you. And next item on the agenda is communications. Mr. Kane?
Madam Chair, there are no communications this evening.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is SUP 04 and SPR 2204 and SPR 2207. Mr. Kane?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Our first and only public hearing this evening is a request from Brian and Madison Chapman to expand the parking area at an existing short-term rental. That property is located at 1811 West Pickard in the CD3L Suburban Large Lot Zoning District. The future land use is residential. The property is currently used as a single-family dwelling and short-term rental. The site area is 1/3 of an acre. This property is located on West Pickard Street. This is just to the west of Bradley Street. You'll note that the property abuts Union Township to both the north and east. Properties to the west and south are in the city of Mount Pleasant. Surrounding land uses are primarily single family, with the exception of those properties on the north side of north side of Pickard Street, which includes a medical office. Most of the land uses in the surrounding area are similar to the subject property, again, with the exception of those properties in Union Township, which have a future land use of neighborhood service and zoning of office and 1 and 2 family. On the screen, you'll see a picture that depicts current conditions. I will say this is current conditions as a few weeks ago when we still had a little bit of snow and we had a roofing project going on at this home. This is looking from West Pickard toward the south and east. This picture will give you a little bit better sense of the area in question where the applicant's looking to expand the parking area. This expanded parking area would provide for parking for both the short-term rental use, but also for the applicant's personal recreational vehicle. Short-term rentals are permitted as a special use in the CD3L zoning district, and so with that requirement, there are certain standards that apply to short-term rentals in the district. These do include standards that have to do with the parking areas on the property, and so that is what brings this back to the Planning Commission. As I mentioned, this is currently a short-term rental. This special use was approved by the Planning Commission back in 2018, shortly after that allowance was made under the zoning ordinance, with the other updates that took place in February of 2018. And so all of these special use permit criteria would apply. They were consistent with this criteria. These criteria are unchanged since 2018. So the primary purpose tonight is to review the proposed expansion of the parking area to confirm that that doesn't change any of the impact of this use in this location. On the screen, you'll see a plan view, overview of the project, and again, a dimension drawing showing the proposed concreting work that the applicant's looking to do on the property. This is primarily along the eastern edge of the existing driveway, and this will be entirely behind the public right-of-way line along Pickard. Just in terms of a quick site plan review, the applicant's not proposing to make any changes to the existing structure. Makes that pretty straightforward. And so staff's recommendation after the public hearing is that the Planning Commission approve SUP 2204 and SPR 2207, subject to the following condition: compliance with the requirements of Public Works. And those requirements are probably primarily going to have to do with filing and adhering to a stormwater permit for the project. The applicant is present to answer any questions the Planning Commission might have, and that concludes my presentation, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Kane. Any questions for Mr. Kane?
I have a couple. Mr. Kane, so you're saying this won't increase a curb cut on the street?
That's correct.
Okay.
All the concrete work will be happening behind the right-of-way line.
And then will this, even with the expanded driveway, will this still meet all the green space requirements?
It will.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Kane? If the applicant would like to come up.
Do I have to say anything?
Yeah, if you could at least state your name if you don't have. And you don't have any comments you want to make? Does anyone have any questions for the applicant? Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll open up public comment if anyone from the public would like to comment.
I was hoping this would be the first ever spouse commenting in opposition to their own comment. Those are the period that Mrs. Chapman's going to approach the podium. Madam Chair, we don't have any electronic correspondence on this case at this time either.
Thank you, and seeing no one, I will close public comment and open up discussion.
Move to approve SCP 2204 and SPR 2207, subject to the following condition. 1, compliance with the requirements of Public Works.
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Next item on the agenda is public comment. If there's anyone from the public that would like to comment, this is your last opportunity to do so today.
Madam Chair, we have no electronic communications at this time.
And seeing no one here that would like to comment, I'm closing public comment. And next item on the agenda is under new business, the 2023 to 2028 capital improvement plan. Mr. Kane?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Each year, as part of the capital improvement plan development process, the Planning Commission's offered an opportunity to review the plan and provide feedback before the City Commission takes action on its adoption. You'll recall that the capital improvement plan includes projects for the next 6 years, and those projects have a useful life of at least 10 years and a cost that's in excess of $20,000. We have Assistant Finance Director Chris Saladin here in person to provide a brief presentation on the plan, and we have City Engineer Stacy Tawari joining us by Zoom. So in the event you have any specific project questions, she will likely be able to address those. So with that, Madam Chair, I'm going to turn over the floor to Chris to provide you with that presentation.
Good evening. It's nice to actually be back in front of you folks in person, so it's good to see all your smiling faces. The capital improvement plan is really a tool that allows us to maintain and improve the city's infrastructure. These projects are really sort of the things in the community that our residents can touch, feel, and the projects have a real tangible impact on the community. It really also allows us to sort of plan out what's possible in cash flow and just get everything, sort of get a plan, get everything year to year, adjust as things come up. But it's really the tool that allows us to say, what do we want Mount Pleasant to look like 3 years from now, 6 years from now, and take all of the not all of the feedback, a lot of the feedback from the master plan and start working it into our budgets. Tonight we're mostly going to focus on 2023. Right now we're actually in the process. We've just started creating the 2023 budget. So really we're looking for input from all sides. So if there's projects that we need to modify, change, delay, whatever the case may be, the sooner we have that information, the better. So we'll go into a little bit more detail on the 2023 projects. We'll hit like a very brief overview on some of the future year projects and talk about next steps. Every city gets to determine, what goes into the capital plan. As Jacob mentioned, ours are $20,000 and they last at least 10 years. Some of the major changes that you'll see from last year. Late last year, we received the results of the stormwater study, and that indicated over the next several years, we have approximately $20 million in stormwater improvements that need to happen to mitigate flooding concerns. And what this plan proposes is to use the $500,000 that had been going towards the repayment of the bonds for the Borden building reconstruction, taking that $500,000 that our residents are already paying and start applying it towards stormwater. It doesn't cover all of the costs, but it's at least a significant portion of the cost, and it at least lets us start making improvements, especially to some of the most key areas to our stormwater plan. Last year, the city received over $2.5 million in ARPA funds, and this plan calls for using $500,000 of those funds for grant match towards the town center reconstruction, which we'll talk about a little more. And it calls for using $525,000 towards the grant matching for the GKB Mid-Michigan Pathway Project, which connects our current trail system to Mission Creek Park, and then at some point in the future, further to the north to the pathway. Aside from that, we also had a lot of projects that started flowing in, not just from the master plan, but just as we continue to look at the infrastructure that we have in place, what do we need to take care of? And so some things that are worth probably pointing out is this plan postpones East Side Park improvements. The Mission Creek parking lot was in a out year to be paved, and we've kind of put that beyond the 6 years of the plan unless we can find some other funding. We have new sidewalks still occurring in 2023 because our engineering folks identified that as one of the key places we need to add sidewalk, but it postpones new sidewalk beyond the 6 years for the rest of the plan, and it postpones pedestrian street lighting. When constructing the capital improvement plan, these are some of the sources that we look to. We try to get as much input as we can from the various groups of stakeholders in the community. One of the questions that we occasionally get is, what is a PASER rating? That's a condition assessment 1 through 10, with 10 being the best for paved surfaces. For the purposes of our plan, that's sidewalks, roads, parking lots. So if you look at one of the project pages and it says PASER rating 8, that indicates the condition of the pavement, and that would be a good rating and something that's in good shape. Also worth pointing out, in the front of the book is sort of a few pages that show the whole plan sort of on a, here's how you can see the whole plan on just a couple pages, and it shows what the balances are for all the different funding sources. It shows where the projects are timing wise, and it shows the ending balances, so you can kind of see how we've tried to move some of the projects around for affordability over the years. So getting into our individual projects for our buildings, at the public safety building, we're looking at replacing some 40-plus-year-old boilers, and the roofing project is the roof on that building is in 4 sections, and this is one of the 4 sections. We've already got 2 re-roofed, and we're scheduled to do one in 2023 and then the last one in 2025. The Borden building retaining wall is the first phase of a 2-phase project, and what that would do is it would replace the 100-year-old wall to the west of where we are right now, and then the second phase in a couple of years would replace the western side of the wall. And really what we've found is basically the wall is moving back and forth, and that's actually causing issues with our sidewalk in front of the building. If you look at it, you'll see it kind of has a little bit of it's not quite a roller coaster, but it is heaving and buckling in places. And that is because the wall is moving, and that's allowing all that ground to move. We had an engineering firm come out and take a look at it last fall, and they said basically you need to either completely redo or replace the wall in front of City Hall. For downtown, we have the annual $30,000 that we put into things like fencing, striping, trash cans, benches, all of the sort of niceties of downtown. For 2023, we're planning on reconstructing Town Center, also known as Parking Lot 3. The plan is basically at this point to make it more of a public gathering space, more green space with elimination of quite a bit of the parking in the parking lot. The project's contingent on using $1 million in MEDC grant funding. If we're unsuccessful with our grant application, we'll have to evaluate what we can afford to do moving forward, but the condition of parking lot 3 is in such poor condition that we have to do something with it in the next couple of years. Our 2023 economic development project is the redesign of Mission Street to improve pedestrian and traffic safety. This would just be the design, and construction would be set to take place in 2024 and 2025. For parks, we're looking at doing the redesign in 2023 for 2024 replacement of the Mill Pond Dam. The pathway, as already talked about, is a partnership with other entities in the community, with the township, with the tribe, with the Mid-Michigan Pathway group. We would also be looking at replacing the High Street pedestrian bridge for our parking lot roads, lots, and trails. Our most recent bridge inspections have shown that we need to do something to address the corrosion that's taken place. Essentially what's happened is every winter, the plow trucks push the salt spray, over the railing onto the pedestrian bridge. And the initial thought a couple of years ago is we can just repaint the bridge, but the more we've had real inspection done on what's actually needs to happen on that bridge, the smart money is actually going to be on replacing the bridge versus repainting it, because you're going to get, it's actually more than half the cost just to paint the bridge because it's over the water, and then you're going to be on a cycle of having to constantly maintain and paint the bridge. Right now the plan is to replace it and then find a way to try to mitigate some of that salt spray that comes off of the road. For Public Works, we have sidewalk on Birch between Bradley and Adams. Our replacement sidewalk is just our annual, where we know we have some sections that are aged out and we have to replace them, as well as citizen complaints that we receive. Our storm sewer extension project is basically extending our existing storm sewer to be in front of more homes, so that gives folks a way that they can actually discharge their sump pumps safely and legally, because right now there's some residents are faced with the choice of discharging to the street or to a backyard or illegally connecting to the sanitary, and none of those are good. Well, in wintertime, some of the ones in the front, the backyards or the streets end up being ice rinks, and then it's illegal to connect to the sanitary. So this just gives residents a way to actually properly handle their sump pump discharge. The storm sewer improvements for 2023, the vast majority of that, like $550,000, is upsizing the storm sewer under Pickard. MDOT is redoing Pickard east of Mission Street, and so this basically upsizes the storm sewer. This is like our one shot to do it, because it will probably be decades before Pickard is ripped up again. At the airport, we have the design of the taxiway with construction set to take place in 2023. And just as a reminder, this is 95% grant funded between state and federal, and the city has a 5% matching contribution on this project. For local streets, we're looking at reconstructing Palmer from Maine to University and Gaylord from Washington to University. We're also looking at thin overlays for portions of Greenfield, Lindale, Mackenzie, Michigan, Oak, and Smalley. For major streets, the only thing that we have are thin overlays on Bellows, Maine, Preston, Washington, and Watson. As you may recall, the Water Resource Recovery Facility, we're actually in the process right now of bonding for Eagle required, basically, plant improvements. And so right now we're working through the timing of the bonding, the timing of the projects. We're hoping construction can start by the end of this year. It may be next year. This obviously does not contain any of that project, since we just don't know the timing and how the dollar amounts are going to fall. It's not in the plan, but it is actively being worked on right now. We just don't have the breakdown, because part of the project is like $8-ish million that's going to be up front, and then a couple of years from now we're going to have another piece in the 10 to 12, $13 million range for the second phase. At the water plant, we have a ton of projects, and most of them are smaller in nature, and it's just really taking care of what we have in place there. It's not anything new. It's just sort of keeping the water plant in good condition and operating. So taking a look at our projects that are sort of ongoing, this is what we have planned out 2024 to 2028. And these projects are more one-time in nature that you'll find in that same 5-year window. Table 6 in the back in the appendices is, if you look at that, that's basically projects that are considered but not planned over the next 6 years of the plan. And that could be because of funding, we had to prioritize them out of the plan, or we don't have enough information about the project that's listed to include it in the plan. So that's sort of the beyond the 6 years is what's being planned. And if we get grant funding, some of those could come into future years. That was the April 25th work session with the City Commission meeting. And I don't believe we are scheduled to have one with the City Commission on the 9th because they didn't have any open items. And so from here, we have tonight's presentation. We have a public hearing scheduled for May 23rd, and then the charter requires us to adopt the capital improvement plan by June 13th. And these 2023 projects will be submitted as part of the operating budget on September 12th. And with that, I'm happy to entertain any questions you folks would have.
I do have one. Did you say $20 million on the anti-flooding project?
Yeah, for all of the stormwater needs across the city, yes, it's approximately $20 million that was identified.
Okay, where's that money going to come from?
Part of it's going to come from this dedicated millage, and the rest of it, we're just going to, we have the ability to use major and local street money for those. But on the flip side of it, because of our census numbers, our Act 51 money is going down a little bit. So probably before I get too much further into the details, I'd probably turn it over to our engineer because she would have more information on.
Okay, is that you say a dedicated millage, so that's going to have to be a millage proposal put on the ballot? Or?
Nope, that $0.5 that's there, that is in the City Commission's purview. If they want to reassign that $0.5 to the stormwater, they can do so.
Okay, so it's already there.
Correct. Yep. It's been there since I believe 2007 or 8, and that's what was used to finance the construction on this building.
Okay.
Any other questions for staff?
I have a question to see if there's any, it wasn't on here, just to see if there was any more advance with the plan for the rerouting of M20 through Pickard, if there's any progress with MDOT for that, or?
That's a great question. I can take that one. The M20 reroute conversation was put on hold pending completion of 2 other MDOT city projects, which is the reconstruction of Pickard, which is going to take place beginning next summer and stretch into 2024. And then the work on Mission Street that Chris highlighted, we're currently scoping out a operational study for the corridor to test some design alternatives. And then once we have those design alternatives tested, see which design alternatives will work that the city and MDOT can agree to, we begin looking at finding funding for design and construction there. And then our hope would be at that point to tackle the reroute conversation, which, given the timing on that operational study, we're expecting that we should be able to scope that and complete that this year. And so we should have some planning and study capacity available amongst the stakeholder group to begin tackling that probably sometime in late 2023.
Any other questions? Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Next item on the agenda is.
Nope. Madam Chair, we're looking for a motion tonight on the capital improvement plan for the Planning Commission to recommend adoption of the plan or to recommend adoption subject to comments on the plan so that we can provide that to them for their consideration as they consider adoption.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone like to make a motion to that effect?
Move to recommend the capital improvement plan.
I'll second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Next item on the agenda is discuss amendment to section 154-410B4 and table 154-410A of the zoning ordinance regarding childcare centers and group daycare homes, and consider setting a public hearing on this issue at the June 2nd, 2022 regular meeting. Mr. Kane?
Madam Chair, child care center regulations were among one of the items prioritized by the Planning Commission for work session discussion in 2022 when we established that schedule earlier this year. Staff has been doing some research on those standards within our ordinance, as well as the history of our standards and the regulations that exist at the state level for childcare organizations. In doing that research, it was my belief that this issue may be a bit more straightforward than I initially thought. And so rather than deflect that to work session in order to get us a little bit ahead of schedule on our work session topics, I'm bringing this forward under new business in hopes that you'll consider staff's recommendation to take action tonight. In your packet, I provided an overview of that regulatory history, which stretches back to 1984 when the city adopted a new zoning ordinance. That's the first time that the city had specific regulations around childcare organizations. And essentially, those regulations have remained consistent in large part since that time. In 1991, the state of Michigan adopted new regulations having to do with childcare centers, which included some new definitional terms. And so at that time, the city did follow suit with some updates to the zoning, but the allowances for childcare organizations were largely similar. Moving into 2018 with the city's adoption of a new zoning ordinance, those regulations largely carried over as presented, with the exception of an expansion of allowance of childcare organizations within areas that were previously zoned C1, C2, and C3, our previous commercial districts. Prior to 2018, childcare organizations were not allowed within those commercial areas. And so there was an expansion in the area in which those organizations could be located. I have met with our local licensing representative from Licensing and Regulatory Affairs who oversees childcare organizations throughout the region and have reviewed the rules that are associated with that licensing regime. Most of those rules mirror the city's standards within the zoning ordinance. The state does review those childcare organizations annually through their licensing process to ensure that they're adhering to those standards. Looking back through the city's history of review and approval of childcare centers, I could not find a denial of a childcare request for a special use permit. And so given that history, given the overlap between the state's regulations and our current regulations, and given what I have heard and what I've from our licensing professional, as well as what I've seen nationally and statewide in terms of concern about a lack of available childcare, I'm recommending that you consider stripping the special use permit standards out of the code for both group daycare homes. Those are the homes that provide childcare in home for 7 to 12 children, as well as for childcare centers. So that would be an outside the home center, a business that provides childcare for children. By moving those to a permitted use category in the districts where they're currently special uses. I'm also recommending that you consider expanding the area where childcare centers are permitted to include both the Special District Research Center, which is the University Park area south of CMU. That would be consistent with the allowed uses in the restrictive covenants that apply to that area, as well as into the civic zone. And so in the civic zone, we have we have schools, we have churches, we have libraries, we have other civic type infrastructure, places where a childcare center might be a good fit in terms of zoning compatibility. And so for that reason, I would recommend inclusion of those districts as well. And so with that, that's just a brief overview of my recommendation. I have drafted an ordinance to that effect, which is included as an attachment in the packet. And my recommendation is that you consider setting a public hearing on that ordinance for your June meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Kane. Any questions for Mr. Kane? I'll open up discussion.
I'll move to set a public hearing to consider the proposed text change at the June 2nd, 2022 regular meeting.
I'll second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Next item on the agenda is staff report, Mr. Kane.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Got a lot tonight, which is exciting. So in your packet, you have a report on administrative site plan reviews, of which I've got 3 to report out. We have reviewed and approved a proposal to construct a rear dining area at Pleasant City Coffee. This is located on the south side of their building. That was approved March 24th, just after your April packets were prepared. We have approved a construction project of roughly 9,000 square foot industrial building at 3727 South Isabella Road. You'll recall that about 2 years ago, there was an administrative approval for a crematorium project on Isabella Road. This is immediately to the north of that project. And that project was approved on April 11th. And finally, we've approved the construction of a 4,800 square foot pavilion at Faith Youth Lutheran Church, which is at 1402 East Preston. And that approval was issued also on April the 11th. And we actually have a couple of additional administrative reviews that are in process. And so I anticipate we'll have some additional reporting for your June meeting. In terms of upcoming agenda items, we have a slew of them. We currently have 5 public hearings scheduled for June. We have a request from Jars Cannabis for a special use permit for their marijuana retailer license, which is currently associated with 1005 Corporate Drive. We have a request from Jimmy John's for a new drive-through restaurant location on South Mission Street. This would be in the former Mercantile Bank building on South Mission, which is next to the current Mercantile Bank building on South Mission. We will have a request that stems from the Zoning Board of Appeals case that Commissioner Friedrich reported out earlier tonight. This is for an accessory dwelling unit on South Fancher Street at Gaylord Street. And we are anticipating an application for a short-term rental on North Kinney. This is part of a existing home that also has an accessory dwelling unit. And finally, the text change that the public hearing that you just set will also be on that agenda, as well as any potential text change introductions that might arise out of tonight's work session. Given that list and the fact that we will be slightly ahead of schedule on our topics for discussion after tonight, I'm not anticipating bringing forward a work session in June. That's my report for tonight, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And any questions for Mr. Kane? If no questions, if someone would like to move to adjourn to the work session.
Move to adjourn to the work session?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Meeting adjourned. Do we need a break or? Okay. Then we can start the work session now, Mr. Kane.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair. We've got 2 topics on your agenda tonight for work session, and these are, again, items that were identified by the Planning Commission earlier this year for discussion for potential text amendments to the zoning code. And so we're going to go ahead and start with item 2, registered student organization dwelling regulations. And I will refrain from reviewing the entirety of my memorandum, so I kind of want to focus on the discussion items for tonight. Essentially, there are some complications with the location of registered student organization dwellings within the city of Mount Pleasant. These are kind of colloquially known as Greek dwellings. So our fraternities and sororities primarily within the city of Mount Pleasant are considered and classified as a RSO under the zoning ordinance, and they have been for several decades. These RSO dwellings are primarily permitted to be in existence in areas where rooming dwellings are also allowed. So that's primarily the old M2 area of the city under the prior zoning map. And as well, since 2018, portions of South Mission Street and East Broomfield Street with an expansion of that allowance under the special requirement that applies to those uses. There has been, the RSO regulations are largely similar to the rooming dwelling regulations with a couple key differences. Some of those differences arose out of the 2015 effort to codify the old M2 redevelopment process. I know many of you were not on the Planning Commission when that was a thing. Some of you were, but essentially the city had a redevelopment process that facilitated some of the new student housing developments that exist primarily south of High Street and north of campus. And essentially through that process, there was some exchange of improvement to the property for occupant numbers. As you may have noticed if you were in the community at that time, that process had some controversy around it. And so there was ultimately a request by the city commission that some of that process be codified, that it be put into the zoning ordinance and be a little bit more explicit in terms of what was allowed and under what terms. And so In doing so, some additional regulations were implemented that applied to RSOs in terms of where they could locate, just as an effort to stem some of the negative externalities that those uses might create. Of course, in 2018, some of the zoning boundaries were adjusted, and so some of those additional location regulations have, in staff's view, become redundant with those boundary lines shifting. And so at the time, in 2015, we were putting a lot of emphasis on providing appropriate buffers to the adjacent residential district. With that line moving to the west, that has in effect provided a pretty significant buffer already, and so some of those additional standards may not serve the purpose they were initially intended to establish. And so, again, with that, staff's recommendation is that you consider 3 discussion items tonight. One, if you'd be willing to consider a text amendment that would provide for some mirroring of the RSO standards with those of rooming dwellings, since the uses are very similar. 2, if you'd be willing to consider allowing RSO dwellings to become rooming dwellings by default. This is an issue that'll come up periodically when an RSO loses its recognition from the university or it dissolves for some reason. There's not an automatic reciprocity of the 2 uses, and so in practice over the years, I think there's been some implicit reciprocity, that this would just codify that reciprocity so that if an RSO happened to lose its status, that rooming status would sort of automatically default into place. And then finally, because there are some challenges, I periodically get calls from RSO groups that are looking to relocate within the community, and the supply of housing that's available to them that fits their needs, which are admittedly self-limited because they like to be co-located near other Greek organizations. But nevertheless, they do have some challenges with finding housing. And so I want to find out if the Planning Commission would entertain having some additional conversations or having staff engage in those conversations about potential solutions for those RSOs who are looking for new housing. So I'll turn things over to you, Madam Chair, for some Planning Commission conversation.
Thank you. Any thoughts, anybody?
I have a question. Now, when they are looking for alternative locations or looking for a location, do they have suggestions of where they're looking for?
For the most part, the groups that I have spoken with are primarily interested in being on Main Street. That's, I'd say,
Okay.
the vast majority of organizations' main priority is to be on Main Street, or to be as close to Main Street as they can be located. To get the right housing, certainly groups have considered looking beyond that point, but it does seem, in my experience, like that Main Street location is a extremely strong motivating factor. And the challenge is that most of those properties are, that's a very limited number of properties to begin with. There are many RSOs already on that corridor, and then the remaining properties are either homes, single-family homes, or are in use as income properties for student housing, and so not always readily available for rent or for purchase by these groups. I've had some very preliminary conversations with folks around the idea of, I think that collectively there could be interest in being in a different location, but there would be a need for that to be a collective decision so that the benefits of being near to each other would exist. There's also the potential opportunity that the city could provide for an expanded area in the proximity of Main Street for them to locate, and that could include opening up opportunity north of High Street, where we do have some existing non-conforming RSO dwellings, to provide for some additional opportunities there. There are several houses that would likely be suitable given their size. They have the classic features of an RSO, and they would be in that corridor where the current RSOs are primarily located. I should have noted in my overview that on the back of your memo, there are 2 maps, and the majority of those RSOs are located in that one area. And you'll see that they do cluster pretty strongly along that Main Street corridor, from approximately Maple to the north down to Bellows.
I guess my concern would be if we loosen it up too much, that the entire corridor of Main Street from campus to downtown would just be either student or RSOs or rooming dwellings. And it would be a disincentive for single families to live along that area. I'm not really too excited about making it too much easier.
I think it would look like the creep everyone's been expressing concern about every time we've had a master plan meeting or zoning ordinance meeting. So there's that issue. I mean,
I think the concerns you've expressed are the reason why in 1984 the regulations rolled back in the manner in which they did. The one thing I would suggest or offer is there may be a middle ground between a full prohibition that creates a non-conforming status for those structures that currently exist and a full open market, as it were, for RSO dwellings, where perhaps there's a stricter level of scrutiny north of High Street. And I'm not suggesting, I don't mean to suggest that that's the primary purpose for bringing this forward or the only possible solution, but that is one item that does exist. I would also just note from my perspective, for the most part, the existing RSOs north of High Street are very well kept. I don't think in any respect those homes are a detriment to the neighborhood. In some cases, those are some of the nicest homes on their blocks, but they do certainly are an intense land use. And even notwithstanding potential party impacts, when you have 10 plus people residing in a home together, that can mean 10 plus cars, 10 plus people's worth of garbage, and some just general impacts that just come from the size of the household.
Mm-hmm.
are there areas near campus that, like, due to the decline in enrollment, might become available options for RSOs that are currently just family dwellings?
That's possible, and certainly any of the areas on the zoning map that have that crosshatch, that is the area where rooming and RSO dwellings are allowed, and it's coterminous with itself. So if a rooming dwelling is allowed, an RSO dwelling is allowed, with the exception of those enhanced buffer standards I referenced that I would recommend the Planning Commission at least consider eliminating so that there is parity in the location requirements between the two uses. But they could potentially expand onto other streets like Washington or Douglas or May or Gaylord in those areas where that zoning already exists as an alternative. And that is certainly an option. The challenge that I have seen is that there's just simply, the market hasn't facilitated that to date. And so when folks have looked and sought new housing thus far, they've been unable to locate something that would work. And not all because of a lack of supply. Some of it does have to do with particular wants on the part of the organizations in terms of the type of housing, the cost of the housing, the amenities of the housing that they're seeking, which just further narrows the type of housing that's available to them.
Anyone else have any other thoughts on this topic?
I would just offer that I think the two primary text amendments that staff would recommend are very minor in scope. Eliminating those enhanced buffer requirements, I think, is something that, in context to the zoning map changes that were made in 2018, makes a lot of sense. And I think it just kind of got lost in that process. And so I think making that adjustment would open up some additional housing opportunities that don't currently exist along Main Street, which would be helpful. I don't know that it'll be sufficient, but it would move us in the right direction. And codifying that default status for an RSO to a rooming dwelling, I think, similar to our discussion a few months ago about liquor stores and the practice versus the code. I think aligning our code with that practice would be a positive step, as well as those RSOs come and go over time. The bigger conversation, I didn't necessarily anticipate that the Planning Commission would be prepared tonight to provide direction on a major change, but I did want to introduce this for your thought. And so as you're in the community, as you're looking at the zoning map, as you're thinking about this moving forward, I do intend on continuing conversations that I've been having with the university and with the organizations themselves to brainstorm on potential solutions. But this at least gets you prepared for maybe a more in-depth discussion later this year, particularly because we may have some additional work session opportunity opened up by bringing this item forward a few months tonight.
Anyone have thoughts on the possible proposed text changes that might come up?
So Jacob, with your conversations with the university, do you think there's fairly a high demand with these RSOs? I know you're saying Main Street, for obvious reasons, why it's all there, networking purposes, everyone's close together, but.
Yeah, I mean, historically, the RSOs have clustered on that road. That's been their home base, and during rush season, you can obviously observe the impact that their co-location has in a positive way in facilitating those activities, because people can traverse from house to house on foot, and it creates sort of a village. And that's, beyond Central Michigan University, that's not an uncommon decision. Some universities host those organizations on campus and may have a sorority row or a fraternity row that's more formally created. And a lot of towns like Mount Pleasant, they just sort of organically come about because the organizations choose to be near each other. They have similar housing desires. So in much the same way that, families with young children might find themselves living in the same neighborhood because they have similar wants and needs in homes and neighborhoods, these RSOs are similar. They're very hemmed in by where they can be regulatorily and also by their own desire. So it's kind of mutually reinforcing. They want to be there. We only allow them there. And there's a very limited number of properties there. And they're in demand for other reasons too. And so it's, I would likely have come forward with a recommendation if I had the golden bullet solution here, or silver bullet. Got my metaphors mixed up, but
Fair enough.
I don't think there's an easy solution to this. I do think the text changes would get us, incrementally 5 or 10% in a better direction. But I do think it would merit additional conversation at the planning commission level about any other creative solutions that might exist to this issue.
So you're saying, these are just minor text. I think some people's concern of there goes the neighborhood, but these texts are
No,
kind of
because
unfounded.
correct, because these wouldn't have any direct impact on the locations, the boundary area in which that special regulation applies.
Right.
And so where they can locate will slightly expand, but it would remain within the current confines of the CD4 district with that special requirement applied. So it's primarily the east side of South Main Street within that district is the primary place where this regulatory change would be beneficial, because currently, because the CD3 zone abuts those properties can't be RSOs, but they can be rooming dwellings because we have a stricter location standard for those RSOs. So what I'm suggesting in part one would be stripping that extra location standard away so that an RSO or a rooming dwelling could locate in the same property.
I think that's fair, yeah. Thank you.
In your discussions, has it been new RSOs that want to come, or current ones just want to relocate?
It's primarily current ones that want to relocate. I've been a little surprised, I will admit, not a historian on the RSOs in Mount Pleasant. And so I was a little surprised to learn in some of my discussions how relatively new some of these organizations are to their houses. So some organizations have found themselves in another organization's old house, or they found themselves in a new house over the recent years. And so there's not as strong of historical ties to the home they're in, but there is a strong sense of community on that corridor. And so for a variety of reasons, membership ebbing and flowing, housing price ebbing and flowing, the needs of these organizations does change over time, and they do just find themselves in a very competitive market. So they've got these other organizations seems like it's usually one or two a year that are looking for a place to relocate. And there's often 0 homes available to them during that time. And so we've seen some move, but not as many as who have expressed interest in moving during the past 5 to 6 years.
When an organization's moved out of a home, has it been easy to resell that home?
It appears so. Not all of these organizations own their homes.
Okay.
In fact, I would venture to say that the majority actually rent their homes.
Okay.
And so they're primarily looking for another rental opportunity for a variety of reasons. The ones that I have not had as many requests from the owned properties to look for new locations. Those folks are primarily looking for opportunities to improve their existing properties.
And are there different sign standards for Greek letters on the front of homes as there is for any other sign? I'm just thinking if it's abutting a residential area, there might be neighbors who are just like, oh, I hate seeing that huge sign on the front of the house across the street from me.
No, and the way the district lines fall, the districts abut at the rear.
Okay.
So there's not a situation where there would be, except perhaps on High Street itself, where there would be someone across the street from something in another district. Everything else is back to back.
Is there a primary motivator for why they want to move? Like rent's too high or something else like that?
Yeah, the high cost of rent comes up quite a bit as a motivating factor. Some of the organizations that constructed new housing did so as tenants, not owners, and are in signed into leases that have acceleration clauses that are pretty aggressive. And so they do find themselves, 5 to 10 years out from construction, paying very high levels of rent. And so that has driven some to look for other housing. Some of them are tenants in housing that they just don't consider adequate. And so they'd like higher quality housing. And then another issue is just simply the memberships do fluctuate. And so there have been some groups that have found themselves in a house that's too small for their needs and others that find themselves in a house that's too big. And so trying to strike the right balance for housing year to year, that's an ongoing challenge. And that's not specific to Central Michigan University or these groups. It's just a Greek phenomenon within the council. So.
Would you say that this would help just kind of like some more foot traffic downtown, having more people down there, do you think, or?
I certainly think it merits consideration of how the city approaches the full corridor to downtown. The city's invested a lot of energy in that downtown to campus connection over the years. And I think we've benefited from the fact that we do have those non-conforming uses along that northern part of the corridor that do bring some additional vibrancy. It's not always positive vibrancy in all cases, but it does bring more energy to that corridor and certainly brings the students, pulls them closer to downtown where they would be more likely to perhaps learn about and patronize the businesses that are located here in downtown Mount Pleasant. This would also align with the city's previous future land use map under the 2014 master plan, identified that corridor as a potential opportunity area for some more zoning flexibility. And that's also consistent with the current future land use map, which considers some potential opportunities for attached residential in those areas. Again, sort of a middle ground between a full bore allowance of any housing of any type and the current model, which is pretty restrictive in terms of allowing single family and with some limited exceptions, some higher density housing types.
Anyone else have any other comments on this topic? Let's move on to the next item, Mr. Kane.
Madam Chair, before we move on, I just want to confirm if staff were to prepare ordinance that address items 1 and 2 for your consideration next month, would that be something that there's broad consensus to do? That's really the only direction I would need tonight before we move on to the next item.
Do we need a motion or?
Not in work session.
Oh, okay.
So I'm just looking to see if.
I don't have a problem with it. I mean, it should be addressed. If we don't like what we see, we can always change it.
Right, this would just be an introduction, and certainly if it didn't hit the mark or you had second thoughts as you thought about it, you wouldn't have to take action to set a public hearing, and if you hold a public hearing and you decide not to move forward, you're still only recommending to the city commission, so there'd be lots of time to turn the ship around if you decided that that's what you wanted to do.
It's just whether we want to make you do more work or not.
Yes, well, and it's also how much do you want on your June agenda, so, which is, is already quite lengthy, but I don't think this would.
Pile it on.
I don't think this would necessarily, once the ordinance is prepared, it's fairly straightforward. I think that would help to clarify exactly what that would look like.
And I'm largely indifferent about 1 and 2. I'm more interested in 3, actually, that we haven't spent as much time talking about, just to see how people in Greek life and others at the university perceive a demand for, the locations of housing opportunities. And there might be other things that, through the eyes of a 20-year-old that we don't necessarily, that we're not always necessarily picking up on either. So I'd be interested in hearing from them.
It'd be a great student project if anybody knows anybody in the geography department. I think that could be a really interesting spatial study to really think about their attitudes around where they'd like to locate. One of the big challenges, and that's a challenge we face citywide, is the student population turns over. So every, 4 to 5 years, you've got a whole new student body in town. And so it's been interesting to see how that organizational history does and doesn't stick in these groups. And so you might meet with somebody and then 3 years later, it's an entirely different group of students in the same organization. And they don't necessarily know anything about the previous conversation or even the names of the people that were part of that previous conversation. And so but it also disadvantages them in affecting change because they're not here long-term. And so part of the reason why I've always kept this on my list is that I feel like they may be underrepresented in the process because of the short-term nature of their residency in the community, but those students are impacted every year by these limitations. So I think it is important to take them seriously. But with that, Madam Chair, I'll let you move us on to the next item. Thank you.
I was just going to add on that real quick. I think it'd be also interesting. I mean, I don't know if this is beyond what we would really do, but part of that discussion, if we're really looking at seeing what further opportunities for housing might be available for them and what they're looking for, if we also welcome to that discussion property owners, like rental property owners, because if we are able to, look at those that are within where we're looking to have them relocate to work with them on that they have a house that they just typically have not had as a RSO house. But if that's something that they could work to make available as an RSO house, work with them versus just like a rental house, that it could be where they could all work together on fitting within what we're looking for a certain designated area for them. Instead of them trying to, like you said, every couple of years trying to restart that conversation and having to piece it all together. And
Okay. Well, certainly a good idea. Anything else before we move on?
Just a quick comment, then we can move on. I'm not trying to beat the dead horse. So are we going to just have all 3 of the items then, not just 1 and 2?
What I will do is go back to the work session schedule and look for another opportunity that I can bring just item number 3 back for conversation and maybe flesh out a framework with which you may all want to approach it. Staff has certainly had ongoing conversations about this issue for essentially the entire time I've been with the city about housing related to RSOs, and that'll continue because those are relationships that exist for other reasons as well, and so it's a frequent topic. But like I said, I would be interested in any kind of general direction or creative ideas that the Planning Commission might have on ways we might approach that might introduce some additional opportunity areas for the RSOs that are just kind of outside the box. I think we've been kind of in the RSO box we're in since 1984, and it's worked. I mean, they have housing, but it is limiting, and so there may be some chances for us to try something new after 38 years.
Okay. I think we're ready to move on now to special regulated uses. Mr. Kane?
So, Madam Chair, another easy topic. So, I brought this forward. This is another area of the code where there was some updating made with our 2018 zoning ordinance rewrite, but not perhaps as far as we could have gone. And so, in general, the city's had special regulated use regulations on the books since 1989. It says essentially a special class of special uses. So whereas a special use typically has criteria that are unique to the use that apply and that property must meet, a special regulated use has to meet an even higher vocational standard. Beginning in 1989 and going into 1995 with some updates, that list has changed over time of uses that are classified as special regulated. The requirements have changed. Up to 2018, we had a petition requirement. So you may recall, those of you who've been on the commission for some time, that folks would at one point have to go out and solicit support from adjacent property owners in order to request location waivers from the Planning Commission. In 2018, that petition requirement was stripped out of the code. The area where special regulated uses was expanded within the city, and that list was reduced with the elimination of massage establishments and tattoo parlors. Those uses actually went from special regulated to permitted, so that's a pretty big swing, but probably largely reflective of some societal changes during that time as well. We currently have 16 businesses in the community that are classified as special regulated, and all but one are liquor stores. Many of those liquor stores are also have other principal use designations, so many of them are gas stations. We had that rash of approvals in 2017 and 2018, actually stretching all the way into 2019 for gas stations that took advantage of some new state licensing opportunities to sell beer and or liquor. We have one non-liquor store special regulated use, which is the All Things Divine Boutique and their fortune teller. And so I bring this forward. The attachment has that list of our Group A and Group B special regulated uses. If the Planning Commission has any interest in amending that list, I would recommend, I believe that the standards that apply to special regulated uses operationally work well. I think the Planning Commission retains an opportunity to review and approve them as appropriate, and those regulations provide you with that framework that I think is effective. I primarily would recommend focusing on the items that are on that list, in particular pawn shops, pool and billiard halls, liquor stores, and the catch-all palm readers, psychic readers, horoscope analysis, or other professions purporting to predict the future. I take personal offense to that as a planner because I think I might fall into that category, possibly if you've read it broadly enough. And so I think there may be some opportunity here for some of these uses to drop off of this list and either shift into a special use designation with their own criteria, or perhaps even move to a permitted use status. And so I'm just looking for direction following the Planning Commission's discussion.
Mr. Kane, any thoughts, anybody?
Has there been any problems with having these on a special use?
I'm not sure it makes any sense for fortune tellers, et cetera, to be on the list. I know we discussed that before. I don't know why they're still on the list, honestly.
What I recall pre-pandemic discussing this in work session was, I think a variety of people on the Planning Commission at the time were having questions about, they had to pool or billiard halls need to be on that, do palm readers need to be on that? Obviously, that was also some time ago, but what I took out of that work session was that, something might be modernized and updated, a bit more streamlined. without recalling specifics of, I don't recall, we weren't just looking at line item, hey, it's horoscope analysis versus palm readers, but rather a sense and openness to seeing if, why it's not a big deal, maybe some things could be struck from this text.
Yeah, pool hall that serves alcohol, would that be regulated under something else because they serve alcohol? Or would it be a bar?
It would likely, if not falling into this classification, be classified as a bar, nightclub, or tavern if it had alcohol service. If it was just simply a place to play pool without alcohol service, then
no one would be there.
It would probably fall into, it would probably make sense in that case for that use to go away from the table and to just fall into the commercial amusements category, which covers bowling alleys and a variety of other uses that are similar in nature.
You could probably take a non-alcohol billiard hall off the list. They don't exist anymore. So
Right. Yeah, I can't think of a place I've gone where they had pool tables and they didn't serve alcohol, so.
Agreed.
I couldn't think of a,
The same
think of a
with bowling
situation that would really be.
Right.
So I guess I'd be okay with that one disappearing off there.
So would taking a few of these out here, like you said, streamline it, would it make it easier for these businesses to just open up instead of having to come through here? Or
Sure.
I guess what would be the benefit of them falling off?
As I guess two examples, so in 2015, the city was presented with an opportunity to review and approve a Planet Fitness, which at that time, health clubs were classified as special regulated use under the zoning ordinance. And so that owner went about the process and got the petition signatures and went through the public hearing. And subsequently, I think the Planning Commission broadly recognized that didn't represent current community standards to have that use classified in that manner. And so we've obviously had a lot of health-oriented businesses open in time since. I'm not aware of any issues that's created. Similarly, when tattoo parlors came off of the special regulated list, they moved into a permitted use list. We've seen neither a proliferation of tattoo parlors around the community, nor any complaints from those that have opened. And it just does... I would say keep in mind that if a business wants to relocate, because a special use permit is associated with their current location, if a business is one that doesn't have really specific building requirements, so it's kind of something that could fit into a downtown storefront or a strip mall storefront anywhere, they just need a door and windows and heat and electric and they're good. That special use permit requirement, it just adds a level of complexity to their operations and their ability to be flexible and move. And so, I would say probably pool and billiard halls, if they aren't serving alcohol, would fall into that category. You just need a big space where you can put some tables. Palm readers and the like are also similarly something that could probably happen just about anywhere. It could probably very easily happen without the city's oversight. It may be hard to become aware that use exists because it's likely going to be fairly innocuous. And if that's the case, and it is fairly innocuous, it probably doesn't belong on this list because it's not going to be creating noise, odor, light pollution. At least from a planning perspective, I don't think that the external impacts of that use are likely to be detrimental to an adjacent property.
maybe you could come up with some suggestions of what should be taken off that we can look at next time. I mean, I'm fine with getting rid of the pool and billiard hall because those don't exist anymore, so.
Those are the two uses that I would look at. I don't have a strong professional opinion on the pawn shop use, but that would be the other one I would recommend that you consider in discussion. If that's something that you would have concern about pawn shops. Pawn shops are licensed by the state, and so it is a defined use. I don't know if that would be a problematic use. I've not, in the 7.5 years I've been here, ever had anyone inquire about opening a pawn shop in the city of Mount Pleasant. I don't know if that's because they looked in our code and thought it was too onerous. My guess is not. My guess is at least some of the people who would want to do that would not do that and would contact me instead. And I've never had a phone call about that. So I'm not necessarily concerned that that is standing in the way of progress, but it is also perhaps something that since 1989, maybe the community's standards have shifted, and it might be worth a conversation if that still is reflective of where we're at today.
So the one we have now is actually in Union Township then?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
And I guess since they're regulated, whether or not they're a special regulated use, it doesn't really make sense for them to also be a special regulated use. If they have state regulations, they have to comply with regardless.
Sure. The only where the city's role would play is where it can be within the city. So the state will license, and if the city says it can be located there, then they will license. So if the city's location requirements just said you could be anywhere in the district, then they can be anywhere in the district. A special use permit or a special regulated use permit would provide the planning commission with that opportunity to evaluate the location and decide if they felt if you felt as a body that it was appropriate before approving it. And again, I would prioritize likely the palm reader category as being the one that in my mind would be the highest priority to consider shifting. Pool and billiard halls also seems like it might be ripe for consideration. I think there also could be a case to be made for liquor stores, possibly shifting to just a generic special use with their own special use permit criteria. But with the permitting the petitioning requirements coming out of the special regulated use category, that does reduce the complexity and make this a less onerous process than it once was. And so there's less, I think, urgency in doing that. It's more on the items where maybe a permitted use category would be more appropriate, where action might have a more real impact.
I guess like the first item in work session, I was largely indifferent about things, but as long as we're discussing it, I would be interested in seeing the pools or billiard halls one, potentially struck out at. And then with the palm readers one, I guess for me, it's really the phrase other professions purporting to predict the future. Because I was seeing if there was a consulting firm doing economic modeling, or if there was someone whose job it was to predict stuff for like the NFL draft last week and their house in Mount Pleasant, you could see it falling under that terminology.
Or even weather forecasting.
Yeah.
So my question with the palm reader one, it was possibly the intent of this to have it so that it was in more of a commercial business location versus like in someone's living room, or like, was that what, for like where it was going to be permitted to be? Was that what the thought was, or?
That could have been part of the conversation, but that could have been addressed by simply listing it in a commercial district as a permitted use or as a special use. My assumption is that the city likely obtained and utilized a model ordinance when it adopted these standards. And so there was likely somewhere at a consulting or a municipal level, someone promulgated a list of potentially problematic uses that had maybe created blight in the community in the past, or maybe had been featured in areas that had other blighting uses in them. This is coming out of a 70s, early 80s era of urban decay, and so you have cities that are experiencing Skid Row, and that phrase actually appears in our ordinance specifically. And so, what might you have seen in a 1970s, 1980s era Skid Row, in addition to maybe adult-oriented uses, liquor stores, pawn shops, maybe a psychic reader, I'm not sure that those same agglomeration effects exist anymore, where these industries choose to co-locate. And I'm not sure that in our community, the way that our commercial districts are oriented, that we're at profound risk of a Skid Row developing, because we really essentially have two principal commercial areas, and they're, I'm not sure that they're necessarily predisposed to falling into a Skid Row condition, or that a psychic reader would be the thing that is the straw that breaks the camel's back. I'm going to get one metaphor right tonight.
Well, I agree with Commissioner Leash on that last one just being problematic the way it's worded too. So maybe eliminating it altogether would eliminate all potential issues in the future. as I'm forecasting the future.
You need a special regulated use approval for that, sir?
All right, well, that's what I need for tonight, Madam Chair. And certainly upon introduction or at any future point, if the Planning Commission wants to revisit any of the other items, we can certainly do that.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Would anyone like to move to adjourn the work session?
Move to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor? Aye. Meeting adjourned.